And like
so.
sustainable supply chains and stuff like that.
Where are the green dots?
Good.
Okay, it got my voice. Good evening, everyone.
Project.
It is 6:05, so we're gonna kick this off. We have a quorum and a very full agenda, and some people who've indicated they want to get out of here at a reasonable hour. So we will try to move efficiently this evening. Josh, you want to?
Yeah, of course. Commissioner Hookham. Here. Commissioner McCoy. Commissioner Clevey.
Here.
Commissioner Mursky.
Here.
Chair Lenski.
Here.
Commissioner Carlene Colvin Garcia.
Here.
Commissioner Zucker.
Here.
And Commissioner McComber. We have one.
Thank you. Okay, so we have the agenda in front of us. As I said, a number of items on there. After our usual energy report, we have an update from the Office of Sustainability and Innovation around the solar, landfill solar proposal. We have a solar access resolution discussion, the Evie Ordinance presentation, and a resolution I think not to be voted on this evening. I think it was intended to be a conversation, but I guess we can discuss that around the Electrification Ordinance and a conversation around solar installs, and then we will move into our committee updates. So do we have a motion to approve the agenda? Or any comments, I guess, any changes? Motion to approve?
Move to approve the agenda.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay. And the minutes, we got the minutes from Josh. Everyone should have seen those come through. Motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, the minutes are approved. And at this time, we'll open it up for public input. We do have a couple members of the public here if you'd like to speak for a few minutes on any topic related to energy. You're welcome to the podium at this time. Good evening.
Thank you, Chair Lenski. Ken Garber. To state the obvious, we are in a climate emergency. And as Greta Thunberg likes to point out, in an emergency, you change your behavior. Sadly, that isn't happening in Ann Arbor construction. Just since the city's last climate action plan in 2012, the city has approved projects that have brought or will bring 5,500 new bedrooms just to downtown Ann Arbor. On the outskirts, in the Duveron area alone, North Oaks, North Sky, and cottages at Barton Green are building out 823 single-family homes, townhomes, and student apartments with 2,800 bedrooms. The U of M has its own building boom going on. All these projects, with a single exception to my knowledge, a small project at 321 North Main that uses geothermal, burn natural gas for heat. This has not even been a site plan review issue. Natural gas heating has just been assumed. But why? Not cost. Practical electrification alternatives exist, and any marginal cost difference would be trivial in the overall construction budget. I think we use gas for the same reason we drive cars on 1-mile errands, take daily showers, and fly to Florida for the winter, even though we no longer have Michigan winters, because we've always done it that way. Last month, I spoke here to you and suggested that you draft and adopt an ordinance banning natural gas infrastructure altogether in new construction, as cities like San Jose, Berkeley, and Brookline, Massachusetts have done. To jumpstart this discussion, we at the Climate Mobilization have now drafted such an ordinance incorporating what we think are the best features of the existing ordinances. Yes, we know that the city attorney and U of M law professor Ode Salim have been asked to look into the legality of such a measure. But we cannot afford to wait for a definitive legal opinion. We must move forward now, so we are ready once the lawyers have signed off. We can't every 2 weeks keep approving more and more fossil fuel infrastructure and still expect to achieve or even approach our 2030 carbon neutrality target. I believe that target is feasible, but only if we radically change the way we do things, quickly scaling up to a World War II scale national and local effort. We must change our behavior for the sake of young people here and everywhere. This ordinance is just an obvious first step to stop the bleeding. We put it forward to start the conversation. In no way do we consider it a finished document. Thank you for giving it your attention tonight and for your excellent work on the commission.
Thank you.
I am Wayne Appleyard, a former member of the Ann Arbor Energy Commission. I want to agree with Ken about getting off natural gas. I just converted my house over to an air source heat pump this fall, and it actually performs very, very well, and it's a lot more even heat. I think one of the most important things that Ken said was that we're in an emergency and we have no time to wait. I want to say thank you to all the people that worked very hard on the Evie Ordinance, several of them on the commission here and several citizens. But it's taken an awfully long time to get that through the process, and it still isn't through the process. We need to try and streamline things. Neither of our council people are here tonight, so I can't ask them to try and speed things up, but time's a wasting, and we need to move ahead. So I hope you'll go ahead and push the EV ordinance onward. A lot of people spent a lot of time on it, and the interesting thing is that we don't have it passed, and we're already seeing these big developments that go in actually installing some EV charging stations on their own. Now, it's not the percentages that we have in the ordinance, so the ordinance is still very important, but we're kind of behind the curve if people are already doing it before we're saying that they should. So, thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Okay. Moving on to the energy report.
Is
News.
it a point of order? Is it appropriate to introduce a motion to adopt this here or at some point later in the agenda?
The EV readiness one or
This
the natural
climate
gas one?
mobilization.
That is on the agenda.
No, it is on the
As
agenda.
a point of discussion,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
Okay, energy report, news from the office and commissioners.
All right. I want to kind of welcome back Thea Jagerliner, who helps a lot as far as Energy Commission work and other work in the office. So she took her 10-month, 2-month kind of break, which ended up being a little bit longer than 2 months. But she's back now with us, so I just want to kind of welcome her back to our office. I also wanted to bring up some information as far as our forums. So every year, we kind of have these forums, I think from January to April. And this year, the forums are really geared kind of towards our 820 work. We actually have in January 30th from 7 to 9 p.m., the downtown library, a energy forum. They'll really focus on some of the different aspects of 820. We have speakers like Susan Fancy, Hank Love, Chuck is actually going to be speaking as well, Robert Jackson, and Julie Roth. So we hope you can join us.
Thank you. Any other news or updates?
I have a quick question.
I do.
Are Kristen Hayden and Catherine Garton still continuing to work for the city on a part-time basis?
Kristen is. Catherine, just because of responsibilities to her schoolwork, had to step down from her position, but she is still very active in the community.
I have something. I'm giving each of the commissioners a copy of the letter I received from the city assessor today. I bring this to you for the following reason. In 2015, Chairman Appleyard challenged members of this commission for someone to take a solar taxation thing to the state tax tribunal. That was after his annual trek down to meet with the city assessor and be roundly told to go back and warm the seat at the Energy Commission. So I did, as you know, we took the city to state tax tribunal, and in the process had a parallel political activity. John was part of that, working with Representative Robbie. Before that, Representative Irwin and Senator Barrett and the Michigan Clean Energy Coalition, Conservative Energy Forum, and was able to get the tax changed at the legislature. And the letter I have here is based, the city attorney telling me that my taxes will be lowered now because of this. So if you haven't gotten a similar letter, you need to contact the city assessor and request it. I also asked him to rebate 100% of my taxes plus interest, and he declined to do so. But I think this is a worthy request that we should continue to push on. So I bring this to you because this all started with this commission. I think this is an example of what it takes to get things done and changed. I appreciate Wayne and the Evie Ordinance. Hopefully we won't have to take the state to the tax tribunal to get that changed. But it takes time, and it takes push, and it takes effort, and it takes more than warming these seats once a month. So congratulations. I know that some of you, or many of you, or most of you share in this win with me, and we have made a difference. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, for all you've done in this regard.
Anything else? I thought I'd just mention here, those of us on the commission received an email from Emily with the city just a few minutes before the meeting started, but about a climate reality training that is coming to Detroit this summer. And so there may be folks in the public or who are watching this later who are interested in applying for that. I'm not going to read all the details from the email, but you can certainly contact one of us on the commission if you'd like us to pass along the information about that. It seems really interesting. Okay. Well, if that concludes our news update, then we will move on to the next agenda item, an update from the Office of Sustainability and Innovation and Landfill Solar.
Well, thank you all, and thank you, Chair Linsky, for making space for this presentation. Just to confirm, I looked through the agenda, and I don't know if this is useful, but I sort of saw there was an interest in kind of hearing what the office is doing broadly and Landfill Solar. Is it fair to give you a quick update on a few other things we're doing?
We would love that.
Great. Maybe read into that email.
We can check off an action item after
Yeah,
you do that.
we
Yeah.
can get it done. I know, and maybe I'll talk about solar access as well. So we'll help you guys get home at a decent hour. So thanks everyone for making space. Thank you for your continued commitment to all of the work that we're doing around creating a renewable energy future for all, a just future for all, and for A20 and where we sort of stand. I want to give you kind of an introduction and refresher on where we are with this work. This has been very much in our eyes for the last several weeks. Just to kind of put this in perspective, we actually passed the Climate Emergency Declaration on November 4th. So it hasn't actually been that long, although we have a countdown in our office, sub 90 days until the plan goes to council. So we are in a sprint. So this background, you know, as we're thinking about A20, I want to start there because carbon neutrality is the umbrella under which everything we're doing falls. So the 5-year work plan that we created still exists, and we are actively working on implementing the programs that are within that. There's just a capital and what we're filling in, and all of the other things we need to do to get to carbon neutrality. And we're trying to round that out as part of our A20 work. So of course, we have to acknowledge that it's not just carbon neutrality in terms of let's get to zero, it's also acknowledging the climate's already changing and we're already experiencing impacts. And so these are the most prominent impacts that we're thinking about in the office. You've heard us talk about this before. You've experienced this, whether that's rain, increases in temperature, or climate migration into the region. And I'm happy to talk about any of these. The migration work is pretty vanguard, working with climate demographers to really understand kind of the influx of population that might be coming into our region. So when we talk about A20, I think it's important to frame the 3 things we think about. Of course, we're thinking about climate mitigation and reducing emissions to zero, absolutely unequivocally. We've got to be thinking about adaptation, and we better be grounding it in equity, right? Acknowledging that those that are the most impacted by climate change are those often that did the least to contribute to the actual impacts that we're experiencing. Moreover, as we're thinking about solutions, let's take rooftop solar. It's not possible for everyone. We know that, right? Which is why we're actively working on community solar legislation and seeing where that can go. It's also why we're thinking about other ways to get people access into programs. So it doesn't mean we stop advancing rooftop solar. It means we just round it out with other things too. So this is a part of what we think about, and I think that's important because we may run with the idea of carbon neutrality, and we may kind of inherently know these are a part of it, but we just want to make it explicit in that discourse. These are just some of the things that we have been actively working on over the last several months, and all of them could warrant their own long-term discussion. Whether that is work that's happening around solid waste and what we're going to do as a community, what that future looks like, how are we going to get to zero waste? How are we not just going to focus on the end of our waste system, so what we're recycling, what we're composting, how are we changing upstream behavior? How are we not generating the waste in the first place, right? So this is a part of the discussion that we're working on and not only thinking about, but actually actively working on with our partners in solid waste. We piloted a Solarized program, which you may be familiar with, basically a bulk buy for residents. We did our first pilot and it was wildly successful, so wildly successful that we're gonna do it again because we are gotta make sure that wasn't like a blip in the system. But to give you a sense, we worked with a stakeholder who had solar installed in her house. She invited 53 of her neighbors into her living room on a Saturday. We came with her installer. 19 of them moved forward with solar.
Wow.
That's an amazing rate for 2 hours worth of work effectively. We brought that kind of demand, and because so many people came forward, they all got 15% off the cost, plus they got the 30% tax rebate, right? So we're gonna try to scale these kinds of programs. We're gonna take them to electric vehicles as well, see if we can find some similar scale to help reduce access, primarily cost access to these programs, but also technically, you know, if you're out on your own, this is complicated. How can we help make this really easy? We are, of course, increasing bike lanes. We're actively working in that space with our peers. We're looking at public transit options, changes to systems. You guys have been frontline with the electric vehicle work. We're working on a grant right now. We're pulling the electrical data to hopefully put in a significant number of chargers in this community, you know, getting close to a 3-digit number of additional chargers in the community. So we're hoping that comes through. And then, of course, every time we touch a street, we have a complete streets policy. So how are we managing all users on that street, but also all the water that's falling on that street, right? Doing kind of on-site retention. And then we are working on, you'll see this soon, an RFP for some deep energy audits at municipal facilities. We have a lot of work to do in our facilities. They're old, they're not always the tightest facilities, so how are we gonna do an actual detailed audit that's disentangled from the upgrades? So not what you saw last time with the Honeywell, the ESCO model. How do we give someone resources to do deep audits and then stop and then do the implementation ourselves, or maybe do workforce training to bring more people into the energy industry? So we're kind of exploring that broadly. And then, you know, we love trees. I don't know if you know this, every year the city plants at least 1,000 trees as part of our ongoing kind of maintenance. How do we continue to scale that up and do that work? So these are just some of the examples of things we're working on, because I don't want you to feel heartburn that just because we're in active planning, we're not still trying to do and make changes on the ground. So quickly going back to A20 then, this is the vision. It is simple, but transformative in its potential intent here, which is working together to not only create but implement a just transition to carbon neutrality by 2030. The tagline to me is one of the most important things in this entire brand that we have. This idea of how are we doing this in a way that fundamentally is equitable, that is sustainable, and when we do those things, it becomes transformative. And I think that's what we're all working towards. You have probably seen this before. This is what we're aspiring for. Josh and Thea did the update to our greenhouse gas inventory last year. You spent a lot of time looking at that. Basically, all of that history is useful to say, okay, from 2000, we've reduced community-wide emissions by about 13%. That's great. Guess what? We're at 0. Because now we're taking the 2018 number, the 2.1 million metric tons, and that's the new baseline. So let's acknowledge that things worked in the past, but we have to rapidly scale up what we're trying to do in order to hit carbon neutrality. And this is that reminder that equity and justice have to be a part of that discussion. And then on the other side, you see an image of a resilience hub, which is something we're actively working on. Basically, this is about neighborhoods. This is about social cohesion. This is about people being able to take care of people, about knowing each other's, about building the adaptive capacity of our place so our residents can handle any kind of disruption that may happen, whether that's climate change or, heaven forbid, something that happens in terms of warfare. Anything you can think of. When people know people, people take care of people. How do we foster that again? Again, you know this, we talk about this in our inventory. These are the scopes. I'm mostly giving this for folks in the audience or who are listening who may not know as much about the carbon neutrality work. That, of course, everything in scope 1 is in bounds for our carbon neutrality effort and our calculations to get to 0. Scope 2, of course, is in bounds. And you can see what we're focusing on for scope 3. So in this case, transmission and distribution losses, commuting patterns that generate outside. We want to understand where people are coming from, because of course, if we're thinking about things like regional transit. We need to understand where people are coming from so we can figure out the kinds of solutions that are the most viable. We're also looking at leakage from methane usage in our natural gas system, and then of course waste, right? Because our waste isn't disposed of in the community, it's shipped elsewhere, but we generate that waste, so we should take credit for that waste. We often get asked about other things that aren't. You might think about the embedded emissions in a building. And the rationale we have at the moment is where there are standard methodologies and standards of practice across the board for how you calculate these things, we take them and we will put them in the inventory. Where there are not, or they are being developed, we say, not yet. Let's start with this because we'll have to do this no matter what. We can add those other things on in future calculations. So just for full transparency. Again, the 4 areas we're working on, so we have our technical advisory committees. We're even organizing our constructs in this way for the public. They're focused on energy, mobility, resource reduction, and then adaptation and resilience. So this might be more interesting as we get into the timeline. I'm going to do a high-level timeline, and then I'm going to go into far more detail than you want to know in a second. So we launched in November. We have 3 phases, and the team is tired of me using this image, but it's like a funnel, because that's what I say all the time to explain this. The first phase kicked off in November. We launched this initiative formally November 13th. The tip of that funnel, or the opening of that funnel, was what we called ideation. Throw any idea you have out. Whether you're a member of the public, you're a commission member, you're a staff member. We looked at what other cities were doing, what was in other carbon neutrality plans or really progressive climate action plans, and we kind of put it all into the mix. Last week, we moved into phase 2. So that's the middle. We've got to start whittling down those ideas. And so this phase is called initial prioritization. So we have a very complicated and hopefully transparent and easy to use matrix that our TAC members, our Technical Advisory Committee, are evaluating all of those actions that were identified through this matrix. And that matrix certainly includes things like greenhouse gas reduction potential, but also equity, technical feasibility. Does the technology exist that we're talking about, or are we banking on something that's not yet ready? Political feasibility, public uptake or willingness, cost factors, et cetera. So the idea is they're going to start prioritizing. And I want to be clear, just because something ranks the highest doesn't mean it's the thing that's going to move forward, because at the end of the day, we have to package something together. So we can't have everything be in the transportation sector, which I can guarantee it won't be, because that's actually not going to be the easiest sector, but everything be in the waste reduction sector, for example, because it seems really easy and really doable. That doesn't help in the other sectors. So just because everything in the waste sector perhaps hypothetically scores higher doesn't mean it's automatically in. So that's the second phase. And then the third phase is effectively a carbon budget. And I'm going to explain what this looks like in a little bit more detail. The date to mark, if you are so inclined, is March 30th. It is the date we go to council. So on March 30th, we have a special work session at 7 p.m. We will be presenting this plan and the budget implications of this plan for City Council. So this is the timeline in a different view. So these are the phases at the bottom. We had ideation, we're in prioritization, we go to carbon budget, we go create the plan, we go to council. We've got these technical advisory committee meetings that are happening, but that is but one of input that we have into this process. We have only 2 town halls actually scheduled. Another thing to mark on your calendar, February 22nd from 12 p.m. to 5 p.m. We'll be at Pioneer High School. It's a Saturday for our second town hall. And this will be the launch of phase 3.
What's the time of that again?
12 to 5. Pioneer High School. And just to let folks know, we heard a lot of feedback about the space. When we did Cobblestone, we scheduled, that was the November 13th event. That was scheduled before we had declared a climate emergency. We thought, yeah, sure, 250 people, like that'll be great. We were wrong. Like we sold out of that event. We had to close registration. Our goal is to sell out at Pioneer because that would mean we had 1,400 people coming. So you can help us make that happen. We have partners. As of today, we have 61 partner organizations, and they range from really big institutions like the University of Michigan or Ann Arbor Public Schools to our Chamber of Commerce is one of our partners, and then we've got the Neutral Zone and the Community Action Network. We are the local NAACP chapter. We just signed on, right there, Main Street Association just signed on as the most recent partner that we have. So it ranges, it's a nice spectrum of institutions, public, nonprofit, private sector entities that are a part of this. So the partners have so far met twice as an entire group. They met December 19th for an equity training. So we brought in a private equity trainer, and they actually walked all of the partners through, because if we're sincere about equity, it can't just be us thinking about it. We need everyone that's part of this discussion to be at the table. We also released an RFP to bring in some consultants to help us do quantification. The reason this is important, we have the expertise and staff to do this. We don't have the time. When you look at this timeline, this is tight. So we put an RFP out for 2 weeks. That's what we're asking someone. You have 2 weeks to quantify roughly 40 actions for us in depth. So this is a pretty big ask. That RFP will close next week, and we'll know who we're moving forward with. I've talked to you about the technical advisory committees, but I didn't really talk about this other part. If you haven't taken these, please do. We have a public survey, and we'll have 3 surveys. We've closed the first one, we're in the second one, and they mirror the phase we're in. So right now, there's a survey live that is that initial prioritization. So we took all of the actions in the energy sector, and we sort of grouped them and said, here are the big themes. Now let's ask the public to vote. What do you like? What seems like there would be some interest in traction? What do we need to develop further and actually flush out in terms of the cost of this and really understand what it would take to implement versus what is dead upon arrival, right? That we just need to either jettison or we have to come at from a very different perspective to make that viable. Yeah.
I have a quick feedback on it. You can basically check everything that you think the city should do,
You can.
but there's no prioritization. There's no force ranking or anything else. So I think you might find out some things that just fall out the bottom because there's just not support. But I fear, I mean, looking at my own, there's checks on by everything. What does that really help? I mean, if
Right.
So, in future, it looks like we're going to be doing another one. You might think about force ranking.
Yeah, so this was a question that we had internally. It occurred to us too, and the intent wasn't to make people say this is exactly what we want. That is the intent of the next one. So we thought at this point we needed to understand if there even was appetite for anything on this list, because the truth is most of the things on the list are going to have to happen, right? And so I actually am much more interested in what really does fall out versus what like 90% of people say they want. So that was the intent, and it was a very challenging discussion to figure out if we should force rank or not. I appreciate that feedback. We might have done it wrong. Let me say this is failure positive, John Mirsky. So we did it wrong, we'll fix it. So please do take the survey. The other thing about the survey that I'm really excited about, and I was just telling Ken and Wayne, is there is some beginning discussion about cost in the survey. So we can start getting a sense for what people are willing on paying and how they're willing on paying for these kinds of activities. And that's really important directionally, because this isn't free. Right? Like as we're working towards this, so we need to get a sense for where we have support. And then the last part is a carbon budget, and the simplest way for me to explain that is, as we get to the bottom of the funnel, the final thing that falls out is the plan, right? What we need to do in that final phase is present not 500 actions to the public, right? We've whittled that down to those that are the most impactful, and we basically present kind of like a budgeting for a city, participatory budgeting, if anyone's done that. You basically say, okay, we have 2.1 million metric tons that we have to reduce. Here are slices of pie. Here's on-street rail, and here's how much greenhouse gas emissions we've reduced with that, versus an EV bulk buy program, versus electrification of our appliances, versus X, versus Y. Build the pie. What are you willing on accepting? Piece it together, get that reduction. That then forces them to tell us what they are willing on taking and what they're not. So that's the last phase of the initiative. Whew. And you only saw 2 public town halls. I don't want you to think we're just like sitting in the office. We've already hosted almost 30 events, actually, that aren't big central events. We've been out in the community. So we've been working with our partners. We've organized youth and had them come to the city. We're going out to them. We're trying to get their input into this. I think I just worked with Galen on this. I think we have 21 events in the next 2 weeks that we're going to, internal, external. We're dividing across the office. We're going to hit easily 60 distributed events as part of this work. So the idea is not big centralized events. The idea is to go to where people are. If you're going to an NAACP chapter meeting, we're going to go to the chapter meeting as opposed to asking you to have a separate meeting with us. We were at the Ann Arbor Hands-On Museum right before the holidays. So we were just talking to caregivers and people who were running around with their screaming kids. We're like, look at this exhibit. What do you think about carbon neutrality? And so you kind of just like let web and kind of ebb and flow in and out of discussions. And it's been great because what we're doing is getting people that we don't normally get as part of these discussions. So we've been busy. And then March 30th, the plan goes to council. So that will be their first introduction of the plan. And then our guess is sometime in April, perhaps around Earth Day, it will be up for adoption. So we will be coming back to you either in April, or likely in March, potentially in April, with the final plan to share with you, or if it's March, you may have a mostly final plan because you're early in March and we're gonna be using that time. So it's up to your discretion if you'd like us to come back, but we would like to be able to present that plan to you. So that's A20, what we've been working on, because I don't want you to have heartburn. Let's talk about landfill solar. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so here's the project. The way I describe this to folks when they ask is we're sort of at step 2 of 10. And there's not really 10 steps, but like directionally, we're still at the beginning. And I need to stop and say a special thank you to Commissioner Huckham, because he has been very helpful in thinking through a lot of this work and making sure we're thoughtful and intentional as we move forward. So there's no thank you. So this project is something that the commission has thought about, individuals in this commission have thought about for a really long time. I have seen documentation going back pre my time where people are sort of exploring this project. And when I came on board, I thought, well, this makes sense. I mean, this is roughly 24 megawatts of a system. It's just shy of that. And that's pretty darn closely tied to municipal, or close to municipal operations and what our demand is. So this seems like a really interesting project. So we went to our utility, we went to DT, and we said, hey, are you interested in this? And they were like, that's a number, that's intriguing, like, let's explore this. And so we've started a partnership with them, looking at this site realistically. So what we've done so far, you may have seen a memo to council. We worked with DT and Black & Veatch to do an initial assessment of the solar potential on this site, which got us just under sub 24 megawatts. We ran a few different scenarios through. To give you a sense of what you're looking at, on the top part, I wish I could, maybe. You guys are, here we go. So this is the landfill, right here. That's close. This is in the city limits. This is Wheeler Service Center, right here. There's a retention pond behind Wheeler. And this is land that is either non-developed, it's just kind of gone, there's hay, there's things in that space, or it's being actively farmed. So this is in city limits. This is in a planned unit development we have with Pittsfield Township, so it's got explicit uses associated with it, which is why I'm going to talk you through the two parts of this process. It is somewhat complicated. You are all experts in this, so feel free to ask any questions and I can go deeper. What we're looking at in the site, what we proposed, again, we ran multiple scenarios to really try to maximize solar on site. This part right here, where you see no solar, has a ground-nested bird called the bobolink, and we worked really, really hard to protect that habitat. So in discussion, we decided to take that out and to preserve that for the bobolink. So that's why you don't see solar on this site. There is solar here, and there is land still preserved for bobolink habitat as well. So we're trying to be really thoughtful. One thing about this project too is we are making sure there is pollinator habitat underneath. Like, this is not a super high in terms of the elevation of the install, but there will be space underneath for birds to migrate. There'll be rows in between where grass and hay and other things can grow, should this move forward. Very cool. There is floating solar over here. So the retention basin, we are exploring that with DT, which is new for them. It's been done quite a bit in Florida, and we're pretty excited about that potential. It looks like it's 100% of the pond. It is not. It covers a portion of the pond, and inherently floating solar means it can move around as it needs to, which is great. And then we've got solar down here, proposed for development. That's all ground mounted. It won't penetrate, of course, with the landfill, so it'll be rested on site.
So that area now you said is part of what's planning plans, or that's still the landfill, that's the part,
This, so we have, this is the landfill.
right?
Can you guys see my cursor?
Yeah.
Okay, so the landfill's closed for anyone listening in the public. You know that, but I just want to make that explicit. Like, there is not new waste going into this facility. This is capped. And then also, for those who care, I do, this is the dog park. So it's still there. We're not taking the dog park. Over here, there's, in the site, it's like marshy land, kind of floodplain. So this isn't being touched at all. We have two neighbors that are here, and there's a little bit of protection, but this is really like farmed land, like hay.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I think it's natural and just mowed, they said,
Yep.
and
The
then used
landfill is
as
This
hay,
part is mowed.
essentially, yeah.
Yeah, and it's mowed, timed to not disrupt the nesting bird habitat. So for process, I'm gonna take you through the two processes because as we talked about, we have a PUD amendment that's different, and then we've got the process with our utility. So what's going to council on Tuesday night is the preliminary studies that we need to do. So what we've done so far is we worked with DTE and we filed an interconnection application. This is a Category 5 project because of its size. So we filed that paperwork. It is in DTE being reviewed right now to make sure everything is appropriate and they can start the next phase, which is the engineering analysis. This process is what any developer has to go through. In the case of this project, our developer upfront is DTE. So they also have to go through this process. The engineering analysis is generally paid for via time and materials. Like how long does it take to run this kind of preliminary analysis? We've worked with them to get an estimate for the first two studies, the preliminary engineering analysis and the distribution study. And what we are presenting to council is a not to exceed $90,000 for the cost of those two studies. So we'll go through this engineering analysis, and that's going to give us some basic information about the viability of this project. One more thing to pause, just to kind of add to this discussion. This is a really great site for a few reasons. One, we have DT lines here. So connecting into the system actually looks potentially great. So what we're studying is, can those lines actually handle this much additional energy? If the answer is no, the project's not dead, because the ITC line runs here. So we actually have a second option of connecting to the ITC line. So that is just a much slower process. So
What's
the
the
first,
ITC line?
oh, is it intercontinental or is it inter?
It's the transmission.
Yeah, it's, I just can't remember the I.
That's the name of the company, ITC.
ITC.
Correct. So it is a large line that can handle a significant capacity. Our understanding, though, is the wait to even start these kinds of analyses. Like, you still have to do the engineering study, et cetera. The wait just to get into that, like getting in that queue, is 2 years. So we're trying to work with our utility because, of course, they control that system. And if we can get this energy onto that grid, we can move much faster than that. If the answer is the DT grid can't handle it, we're going in the queue. So it'll just take us more time. Great. So we'll do the engineering analysis. If it comes back showing no fatal flaws, that this looks like it's potentially feasible, then we go to the distribution study portion of that. These are the two we're asking for funding for. So if they work, we don't have to keep going back to council and delaying that, because it takes time. You are very much experiencing this with your heartburn. The amount of time it takes to write a resolution, get it through legal. So let's just pull the trigger on the first two studies at the same time, because those really are, in a very colloquial way, kind of the sniff test. Like, can we do this? Can we actually move this forward? If the answer comes back, yep, it can handle it, then we do a detailed design analysis. And now we're talking about what's it going to cost to upgrade the infrastructure, what's it going to cost to actually build the infrastructure. And this is getting us that really detailed number that we can then go back to the public and say, okay, this is what we're talking about, or to council and say, this is what this is going to cost us per kilowatt of energy consumed for the city. So this is not for the public's consumption. This is a municipal operations project. We are doing this in partnership with Pittsfield Township, and so that makes us also very unique. For those who geek out over power, which I am learning to do, this is effectively a virtual PPA, or a contract for differences. Right. So if all of that goes well, we know the cost, we say yes, we go into construction. That's the process. That's the DTE process. Simultaneously, we have to amend the PUD with Pittsfield, because right now the PUD was for other uses. It didn't have solar envisioned at that time. So we've started that process. On January 7th, we held a public meeting last week in which we started to talk about the site plan and get feedback from the public. We have filed an amendment to Pittsfield with the design for this system and the zoning amendment to make this change. We have gotten preliminary feedback. We're going to make a few revisions, and the goal is that these are tentative timelines, but it looks likely that sometime in February or early March, we'll actually be going to the Planning Commission to get their approval of this design. If they approve it, then in April, we'll go to the Board of Supervisors for the township, and if they approve it, the PUD is amended, and we have permission to continue doing solar. So we're doing both in parallel as opposed to one first. The reason for that is twofold. The ITC timeline is so late that to get into that queue, we have everything kind of perfectly timed that we'll know whether this is viable or not from a DTE perspective. So if it's not, we get into the ITC queue because it only opens up once a year. So we want to have that answer in time. The second, the 26% tax incentive. That if we get through this process, we might be able to safe harbor and lock in that 26% this year. And that's significant on a project of this size.
So when
Go
you
for
do
it.
that, make sure that the sun is in front of the array, not behind it.
It just looks so shiny, Mark. Yeah, no, thank you very much,
Just saying.
Mark.
That's a good
Love you. It's great. I hope that's the only comment we get. This, again, is not for you. It's mostly for the public, that this has enormous values for us. There are lots of reasons we're pursuing this. Of course, our carbon neutrality commitment. This aligns with our goals around clean energy. Council set a goal that we had to be powered with 100% clean and renewable energy by 2035. I'd like to hit that goal by 2022 or 2023. That has to be demonstrative of where we're going. John?
This is electric only, correct? It
Correct.
doesn't offset anything from burning gas to heat the facilities and things like that. So it doesn't really offset all municipal operations in terms of total greenhouse gases. It's just electric use, right?
Right. So with that, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so we are looking at electrifying all of the, basically HVAC systems, everything within municipal operations. So that way we can have that basically be on the grid.
Yep. Okay.
So we're looking at VRF systems,
Right.
Geothermal options, things of that nature.
And you're gonna continue to use landfill gas energy to get rid of the methane until it
That's correct.
decays out.
That's exactly right. So we have a landfill gas capture system right now, and we're going to
Yep.
continue to operationalize that. We have far more control over city operations. So things that I didn't necessarily talk to you about are, we're working on an electrification policy for the city. Right, so you replace an appliance, it's gotta be electric, period. If it's getting towards the end of useful life, it's gotta be electric. We already operationalize that in practice, but we don't have a standard policy. So the idea is, do the energy efficiency work, lower the demand across the board, electrify, and then we are still modeling that this is gonna be close to 100%. We have a lot of efficiency savings, for what it's worth.
Yes.
And then, of course, this is a sizable influx of renewables into our grid, and we think that's really valuable, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. There's jobs that are created, not necessarily, like jobs from the neutral zone, for example, but that doesn't matter. Like, we're creating jobs in our community. It's also a demonstration project. If this moves, our understanding is we'd be one of the first municipalities to do a virtual PPA. And this paves the way. Like, it's complicated, and it's paving the way for others to figure out how to replicate and do this kind of a project. And that's exciting. Of course, if we can displace dirtier fuels on the grid, that's another benefit. And then there is price hedging that could be a part of this equation. Because when we sign a contract, we're gonna lock in an electric rate. So if the electric rate skyrockets in 10 years, we're not affected because we've locked in a rate with our utility. So there's some potential price hedging. Of course, it can go the other way if prices drop too, but I don't see that realistically happening. So those are just some of the things that we're excited about in terms of this project. For the commission itself, it would be wonderful if you do support this project to share that support as we go into council next week. We would certainly welcome that. Again, it's a $90,000 ask. We would appreciate your support of the PUD amendment. There's nothing I necessarily have an ask for you at this moment unless you have an interest in coming with us when we go to the township to make the petition, to make the changes. And then we commit to keep giving you updates if you want them on how the project is progressing. If we're wildly successful, we'll be able to actually safe harbor at the end of this year, and we'll be coming back. I mean, you'll hear every month from Josh about how we're progressing on this project, but we are committed to coming with a much more detailed analysis when we have the detail to give to you. We're just, again, at step 2 of that process. This is the project.
I did want to mention really quickly, thanks to Mark Clevey, we do have the resolution in support of Pittsfield Township as well. In front of us.
And commissioners do have a copy of this.
Great.
Questions, concerns, heartburn?
Just an observation, you know me, I'm not bashful. I will say that your option 2, which is dealing with MISO, is just, you're gonna find very quickly it's not sustainable, it's just very expensive. 2 years is not even a fixed clock, and their current queue is even extending longer.
Okay.
So I would not hold that up as being a real competitive ideal. It's just not really feasible.
I agree that MISO's time schedules are not always reliable.
Thank you.
And if you want to see a 24 megawatt project in a municipality, you can come see Delta. That's the one I built a few years ago, and that's running reasonably well, and I can share performance data if you're interested to show you what it does.
Dang it, Chuck, we should talk offline.
One question just about, is any of the power gonna be able to go directly to Wheeler behind the meter or anything, or is it all just going out? to the
Yeah,
grid?
so that is part of the detail that we're working out, especially that floating solar is on the same parcel line, like it could potentially make sense. We did model rooftop solar and solar carports and other things, and in the end, those proved more cost prohibitive. So as we designed the system, if we could get the same output, we went the other way. So I appreciate that, and it is definitely in our mind. We just haven't crossed that detailed bridge yet.
I'm just curious about the role of DTE. So you said DTE is essentially the developer in this and a partner, and I guess the question I have, and I think it's more because I think council will ask that, is doing a sole source with DTE, is that more efficient than, could you do a competitive RFP or something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we made the choice of working, whoever is the developer is gonna have to work with DTE, right? Like, they're gonna have to go through this whole process anyway. We made the choice of working directly with them. We are working on, with our legal department, on a memorandum of agreement with DTE that explicitly outlines the roles they have from the city, the roles and expectations for DTE, so that we're all really transparently honest with each other about what we expect, and protecting ourselves, honestly, from anything that could happen in that experience. And that's true also very candidly on DTE's side, right? Like, they're taking a risk going through this project with us, and so we all need to make sure that we're in good faith going into this relationship. So we could put an RFP out and go through this process. We have chosen the path of working directly with the utility, since someone's gonna have to work with the utility anyway.
Yeah, and I guess the question that, again, this isn't, so I don't have any problem with this, but is there a difference in cost when you take that perspective?
I cannot answer that in a way I think others at the table can. My understanding is that time and material would be charged, period. So we would be paying what we're paying. What is, I think, perhaps somewhat different in this is they've agreed to open the books. So we can see very transparently what is being charged and how the process is unfolding in a way that hypothetically, should Delta do this project, they may not be kind of generous and kind. So my understanding, and I'm gonna turn this over to any of our more experienced colleagues who have done these kinds of projects, my understanding is that no, we're not getting a different price. Would that be fair?
That's, yeah, there's no rules on the pricing, but the fact that a utility needs to follow a process that the MPSC approved is there. So I think by them acknowledging that they're gonna maintain a cap with an open book mindset helps a lot.
I think the operative term here is this is a customer request. So if it was General Motors or Steelcase or someone saying to the utility, we would like you to, give us green energy, they could dedicate and carve out and do that. In this instance, there was not power available. So this is a customer request to do, on-site, new solar, new stuff here. Yeah, this is DTE's property, and they will charge, as they're allowed to, and they don't even need public service, my understanding is you don't need public service commission approval, because responding to customer requests is, it's the utility's choice of how to do that.
I don't
It's
know
DTE's
that is
property?
fully true. It is not. It's our property, and then Pittsfield's property.
No, but those, but
Oh,
The equipment
assets.
itself.
the equipment itself is,
Right.
right.
So-
how they- right.
I mean, that's right. Like, that's the bread and butter for them, right? It's
Right.
like owning and operating the asset.
Right.
Like, that's the
Right.
draw for them. It's
Sure.
not this magical, you're putting 24 megawatts on the system. Like, that's not
Right.
the thing that's selling them. That said, I do think we have to go to the MPSC for the rate.
Well, the MPC was, to make sure that you're not violating any laws or rules, it's that kind of a clearance, but this isn't part of the DTE's integrated resource plan, although it will count against it, but they don't have, it's not in their plan to put up 25 megawatts of solar energy
Right.
in Ann Arbor or anywhere in
No,
their
they have a
territory.
5 megawatt plan for the next 5 years.
Right, so I think, so the partnership is, it's very important as a model-setting partnership, because it's taking the idea of customer request and cities taking a lead on that being a customer, as opposed to General Motors or someone else like that. And it's happened, they probably have examples of customer request response relationship as long as their arm, Shoshona's arm at least, in other things that I'm aware of.
Would
I
they
mean, this
likely?
is a routine, this is not some big exception. This
I
is-
do also just want to piggyback off that DTE is creating kind of a different, basically, not quite office, but they're creating a division to kind of create similar things like this.
Yeah.
So I do think that it is very groundbreaking in the sense that, this is kind of a model that can go forward.
Yes.
I apologize for being late today. So I would figure that DTE is probably looking at this as one of their voluntary customer programs and under the Section 61 and being able to completely vet the project so that the costs are completely borne by the City of Ann Arbor in a bilateral agreement, right?
That is correct. It is something that we've been struggling with, so maybe we could have a sidebar about that.
Where's part of a block and a stack that doesn't have a name?
Other questions?
I have, I guess, a comment about the first part of your presentation. Can you go back to the greenhouse gas inventory slide?
Sure.
And
Never.
I'm glad that you showed it right up front. What I think is really striking and what we need to keep on reiterating to all of our stakeholders, if you look at the slope of the curve between 2000 and 2018, and then we have a commitment that it goes to 0 by 2030. That, as Ken Garber mentioned earlier, means we have to change our behaviors. And we've done a lot of what you presented earlier in the past. Under different leadership, under different circumstances, we have a much more robust plan going forward. But I'd like to point out a couple of things. U of M now posts their greenhouse gas emissions for 2019 on their site, and they went up 2.4%. So they're going in the wrong direction. I assume that the number is correct. I checked tonight, again, it's the same, and I first looked about a week or 10 days ago, so they were obviously very fast in showing it, but they're going the wrong direction. And I think the message has to be to all of us and to council that we can't keep on doing things the way we did them in the past. And you cannot count on new technologies. There's a really good video that I can't remember I don't think I sent it to commissioners, but I sent it to some other people in the community talking about the challenge. And new technologies are adopted during sort of their major adoption phase at about 2% per year in terms of penetration rate. We're not going to be able to depend on new technologies. We have to deploy what we're doing right now, and that's why I think the resolution that's we have later in front of us about natural gas are the kinds of radical things that we need to think about doing. Because you can see business as usual, and that got us not very far.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, most of that, or a fairly large chunk of that business as usual decrease from 2000 to 2016 really came from the grid and
Yes.
did not require any behavior change. People still
Exactly.
got the same reliable electricity and natural gas and drove the same vehicles.
Right.
And it all came pretty cheaply too, because of cheap shale gas coming out during that time, that transition off of coal and onto natural gas for electricity generation meant that, over that period of time, it's, people's energy costs have been growing at not more than the rate of inflation, right? And what we're talking about to get from here to 2030, we're talking about things that are behavior change, things that are kind of lifestyle change, or at least people feeling like there's a risk to that with some of these newer phase technologies, and certainly higher costs, right? So all of that, I think, just has to be kind of acknowledged, and it makes it a lot harder.
I think that's a really important point, and I want to say that would be an and to me, that it's behavior change and it's systems change, right? Like, it is fundamentally how are we changing the system, because it doesn't matter if you can't have an option in terms of your electricity. If you just have dirty electricity, it doesn't matter, right? Like, we have to change the system across the board. And so I think that's what we are intentionally thinking about. What are behavior changes that individuals can make at a household level? What are neighborhood-based changes? What are changes the city as a regulator can make? What are changes city as an influencer can make? Right, so like, where do we have to be thinking about legislative and policy change? Where do we can't control building codes, right? Like, that is a big impediment to doing some of the things we need to do. So we're trying to think across those scales. So I just wanted to say and, mostly because it's a pet peeve of mine when people put it all on the individual, because the individuals in a capitalist system don't have as much choice as we think they do. They just don't, so.
And I think the city is a microcosm. It's really, if you look at it from a macro level, so I'm a macro economist from an undergrad, so I have these little theories, but think about the state of Michigan. I mean, we have, if you think we have to make personal changes, the state's gotta make some changes as well, because we depend on manufacturing and tourism for our economy. Are we willing to forego those things? Because number one, obviously tourism brings transportation to the equation. Manufacturing has tremendous amount of use of heat and emissions are byproducts. So are we willing to forego state-based economy-driven behaviors? And if we make differences there, what we do as an individual might make a difference, but I think will be less impactful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's maybe a different stream of thought. I would say it's not forego, it's transition, but that's it's a different thing. I just want to take us back to the initial presentation, just and really just take a minute to thank you for running what is, I think, both a thorough and an accelerated process to get the plan. Because I'll speak for myself, but I know I've talked with others on the commission who've shared this. A enthusiasm for going towards carbon neutrality, but a little bit of fatigue of planning, right? Because we spent many, many years on this commission planning, but without any dedicated energy dollars, right? And then we get energy dollars. Some of us are going, well, do we really want to spend a lot of time planning? And I just think you're doing a masterful job of both, doing a plan, which we absolutely need, but doing it in a quick, thorough, engaged way while still moving forward. So I just want to take a minute to acknowledge that, because I know there was some skepticism, I'll own it, from me and others saying, this is great, but we want action, not planning, and I think you're doing a great job, Allison. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to I know we need to get back to the landfill solar thing and talk about the resolution, but on the original presentation around your actions, I did want to just ask kind of the question about, you talked about coming to council March 30th, and then you said, I think mid-April timeframe, having something for them to vote on. And I just wanted to ask if you can either let us know or come back at another time with how you guys are thinking about the political engagement on that. Because when it comes to council, getting the votes is really important. I guess, I wonder kind of how you guys are thinking about it strategically in terms of, is it gonna be one plan that's up or down? Is it gonna be a buffet of, you can pick and choose the things you do or don't like? If it's one plan, is everybody gonna have the one thing that to them is makes it a veto, right? And how do you then come with the plan B and so forth? And then, so that's kind of the question around how you guys are thinking about that strategically. And then I think more importantly is how can we on the commission help? If the plan is going to be ready on March 30th, and you want to vote in mid-April, do we need to make sure we are prepared to have a meeting during that time, even if it's a special meeting, so we can vote on a resolution in support? I don't know if you want to react now or just think on it and come back at another time.
No, thank you for raising that. So we've started to think through these issues as well, and I believe and I hope that Chair Linsky, you got an invite for this Friday. We're going to be meeting, if you're free, with you, the chair of the Planning Commission, the chair of the Transportation Commission, and the chair of the Environmental Commission, to start thinking about these questions together and the roles for the different commissions and kind of supporting this or not if you don't support what comes out. So we're going to bring you into that discussion, actually. So I don't have an answer for you because I authentically want to hear your ideas.
Okay, thank you.
And one quick question on with looking at the bar chart here. Would it be possible to put essentially the impact of that 24 megawatts? And what does that get us out of that bar?
Just under 2%.
Okay.
But it's
But
something, it's
yes.
not
Yeah.
zero,
Yeah.
so.
It helps
there you
put things in
go.
perspective.
Yeah, to give you a sense, it's
Whatever.
just under 2%.
Okay,
Thank
thank you. Do we want to move to, we have a resolution in front of us on the landfill solar. Do we have a motion to discuss and
So moved.
bring that? Second?
Second?
Okay. I think we should probably read it for members of the public out there. Does somebody want to?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
No problem. resolution in support of a purchase order with DTE Energy, DTE, to conduct initial engineering and distribution studies regarding a potential solar energy facility and surrounding the Ann Arbor landfill, not to exceed $90,000.
Can I pause you there for a
Yep.
second? Because I think what that first page is a lot of what Missy just took us through. The
Do you want
second
me to do
page
the
has the
whereas?
whereases and the, what we're actually voting on.
All right.
I think that's right? Yeah, is that okay
Yes.
with everyone?
Whereas?
Just so that we don't have
Start at
to.
whereas?
Yes,
All right.
thank you.
Three
So
pages.
read it, I was reading it. Whereas, the city of Ann Arbor has set aggressive climate and energy goals, including the goal of powering 100% of municipal operations with clean and renewable energy by the year 2035. Whereas, city council recently passed a climate emergency declaration and requested that staff identify how the community could achieve carbon neutrality by the year 2030. Whereas the land known as the former Ann Arbor landfill, the land surrounding the Wheeler Service Center, and parts of land currently held in a planned unit development with Pittsfield Township, known as the landfill, have been identified as a strong location for a large solar installation. Whereas preliminary analysis of the site has found that a significant solar array could be developed at the site. Whereas staff have already submitted a planned unit development amendment to Pittsfield Township that would allow this portion of the site to have solar. Whereas developing this site as a solar energy facility would significantly advance the city's climate and energy goals. Whereas DTE has agreed to work in partnership with the city to understand what it would take to develop the landfill into a solar energy facility. Whereas the next steps in the process include the completion of an engineering review and a distribution study. Whereas DTE has provided guidance that these two studies will not exceed $90,000. And whereas funding for these studies is currently available in the fiscal year 2020 budget of the Office of Sustainability and Innovations. Resolved, the Ann Arbor Energy Commission supports the development of a solar facility at the former Ann Arbor landfill and the land surrounding the site. And resolved, the Ann Arbor Energy Commission supports the opening of a purchase order with DTE not to exceed $90,000 for the completion of a preliminary engineering review and distribution study without regard to fiscal year. And resolved, the Ann Arbor Energy Commission encourages City Council to support the opening of a purchase order with DTE not to exceed $90,000 for the completion of a preliminary engineering review and distribution study to understand if the former Ann Arbor landfill is a viable site for solar energy. End.
Thank you very much. I'll open with a quick piece of feedback I had sent along. I hope it's seen as a friendly amendment here, but I was concerned in this, the first resolved, we say that we support the development of the solar facility, and in the third, we say we want to look at whether it's viable. And I can't support something that I don't know whether it's viable or not, so I just propose that we add the language, I think supports continued exploration of the development and
Another option would be simply supports the concept of.
yes, that would be,
So we just substitute development for concept.
In the same vein, Shoshana, maybe the last two resolves can be merged together, because the concept of supporting the opening of a purchase order is repetitive.
yeah, I mean, I think you could probably get rid of the second resolved and simply say that we encourage city council to support it.
Right.
I have a
So,
question too.
simplify it.
Yeah.
Question on the fiscal year. Missy, could you advise on the regarding the fiscal year? Are we trying to get this accomplished this year? Does it matter when we spend?
No.
I'm sorry.
No, not at all. So it's in our budget for this year, which is why that needed to be in for the fiscal year for planning purposes. So that is more of a internal finance
Okay.
phrase that's in there for standard. It's,
That's what I thought.
yeah.
Thank you.
we can cut it out.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've had two friendly amendments introduced. Any other discussion, questions, debate? Okay, do people have a preference on the first amendment, whether it's the concept or continued exploration? Or just pick one?
Just pick one.
Concept, okay. We'll nix the word
Concept and
development in the
change one
first,
word.
the first resolved, call it the concept of a solar facility.
Good.
We'll delete the second resolved paragraph, keep the third one in there. And I guess we can vote on it, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
I just, there's one
Oh.
the phrase of without regard to fiscal year, if that needs to be in it, we need to slide that part down into probably the last, resolved.
Do we
Doesn't need
need
to
that
be.
if we're supporting the third resolved? Misty, please.
Another finance term, without regard for fiscal year, means that I don't have to come back to you and ask permission if the study goes into next fiscal year, which would be July 1st. So without regard for fiscal year means we have this money, this PO can be open, not aligned with fiscal years. Does that make sense? So it is an important phrase.
Should we move
It
it
is
down then?
Yes.
Include it in the,
I apologize because I'm not looking exactly what you're looking at. It does not hurt to move it down.
with regard to fiscal
Did you
years
just
in the
cut it?
second resolve,
Yeah,
which
we
we have
cut the
eliminated.
second.
Yes, I would highly support
Okay.
that, should you
Good
be
catch,
open
Carly.
Is
to.
it moved?
Thank you.
good.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I think in the second resolved clause, it comes after the completion of a preliminary engineering review and distribution study, and that same phrase shows up in the third, so we would add it after study, comma, without regard to fiscal year, comma, to understand,
Perfect.
dot, dot, dot.
Agreed.
Want to take another vote?
Okay, we gotta vote again.
Yes, we do.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, thank you, that passes.
Ta-da.
And we can move to our next agenda item on the solar access resolution update. Do we have something in front of us on this one, or this is up for discussion?
I was gonna pass out a box of Kleenex.
The update is, it's with legal. The honest answer is, we heard that they are working on a memo to go to council in advance of their February 3rd meeting. So they'll have recommendations. We thank you all for the analysis that you've put into this. We have handed over things, months ago. This is tricky. So legal has really, really struggled with this question. They've been looking at other examples and figuring out what is and is not possible. So what I understand is going to council is basically, here are your options, here are the pros and the cons, and here's kind of legal's recommendation. So they will have that for the February 3rd meeting.
Thank
That's
you.
what I have for you.
Thank you. Okay, and I guess we'll hear then, coming out of that, we'll see the memo and can come back together, and discuss what, if any, next steps we have after that. Yeah, okay. On to the next agenda item then, the Evie Ordinance, and we have a presentation for that, as well as, do we have a document in front of us on that one? Not for that one, okay.
Yeah, that'd be good. So maybe I'll start real quickly while you're doing that. We're going to sort of team tag this. Carleen and Jay and I are among the commissioners that serve on this subcommittee. The other people serving on the subcommittee are Commissioner Hookham. No, you
Infrequent participant.
not a free, that's true, but you've been part-time at
I
least, or
won't
at least.
take any credit.
Okay, but we've had staff Emily Drennan, Robert Gordon as a resident, Charles Griffith also as a resident, and expert from the Ecology Center, Anna Stefanopoulou, who's with the University of Michigan and head of the Energy Institute, and then also Wayne Appleyard, former commissioner, along with myself.
And also Craig Tepfer.
And you're right, sorry, thank you, Craig Tupfer, too. Yep. He wasn't on the email that I looked at, distribution, so that's why I missed him. Thanks, good catch. So we're going to give you a status update on where we are, with the opportunity maybe to give some comments. We don't have a resolution, but I think we would like to do is then bring a resolution in support of the ordinance to our next meeting so that we can get it approved, that it can then move on to other commissions and to council. So I'm going to take the steering wheel, and as I told Carleen and Jay, is to just step in, and then I'm going to take the steering wheel and give it to Carleen. Hopefully we don't go off the road in doing that.
All right.
So this is a pie chart of greenhouse gas emissions nationwide, and you can see transportation is 29%. This is how it breaks down into contributions from various types of modes of transportations and vehicles. And you can see the majority by far is light-duty vehicles and medium-heavy trucks. And then you've got a bunch of other miscellaneous types of transportation. In the city of Ann Arbor, transportation is in the 17 to 18% range. I apologize, some of these charts, certainly for people that are viewing via video, may have a hard time reading some of the numbers, but I'll try to read them. So in Ann Arbor, it's roughly 17 to 18%, and the difference is the different modes of transportation that are included in the national figures that aren't included in our inventory. So we're not including air travel, we're not including boat, and major logistics types of travel. We're only really including the kind of travel that's within the city bounds, and that doesn't include rail, those kinds of things. So that explains the majority of the difference.
It also doesn't include people commuting in and out of the city
And it doesn't. I mean, until they get to the city.
until they get to the city.
Correct.
limits. Yes.
Correct. And then, this is just another breakdown of the chart that we've seen before that Missy also showed us, and the same figures for transportation. Oops, did I skip a slide? I don't know if I can go back. Pardon me?
Does it work with the arrow?
I tried with the arrow.
Oh,
Oops, there, maybe.
yes.
Yeah, here we are. Okay, very briefly, as an overview, not so much for us, but for the general public, we had, with the climate plan, emission targets, 90% reduction by 2050. With the resolution adopted by council, that's now carbon neutrality by 2019, as Missy had presented earlier.
By 2030.
So we have the context. We also have the Office of Sustainability and Innovations 5-year work plan here. That'll probably be updated as a result of the whole process with A20 and all the projects that the technical advisory teams are working on, as well as what we get out of the budget process with the city. But you can see Evie Readiness was a part of that. And we've had a committee, the one that I talked about, that's been meeting regularly for probably a year now. So why are we doing this? If you look at growth of EVs, this sort of gives a spread of different scenarios. You can see there's one very slow scenario from MISO, which basically is just a flat curve. It's not really very typical of what you'd see for adoption of new technologies. The Bloomberg scenario is something that's the more typical kind of S-curve here. But you can see the range, at least, that we're working at. So anywhere between 6 and 12%. I think almost all of us that have been working on this think that the Bloomberg scenario is by far the more likely scenario. So here's another way of looking at that with a moderate and high growth scenarios. Just to put things in context, the total number of registered vehicles, I think Charles told us was actually Washtenaw County, but there was an email that he sent to some of us today saying he thinks that number is low, 250,000 vehicles. Also, in the same email, he confirmed that the number in the box, let me see, I'll get out my notes, is actually incorrect. The 1564, let's see, no, that is the correct number in the box, 1564. The number that's incorrect is 2018. That was 1,171. So you can see that in just a period of roughly 1 year, we had an increase of almost 400 EVs in the city of Ann Arbor. And again, you can see significant growth projected. In terms of infrastructure, the idea, this is, by the way, a study that Charles did together with an intern at the Ecology Center, showing what is probably needed in terms of charging requirements and charging stations in the Ann Arbor to be able to accommodate those growth scenarios. You can see the current infrastructure on the left, 14 and 60, which you're probably having a hard time reading, is the needs. So the belief is that by 2024, we need to get from 14 DC fast chargers up to 49 in a moderate growth scenario and up to 60 DC fast chargers, level 2 chargers. We need to get to, sorry, there's two different colors. That's actually yellow in the one box and red in the other. I'll need to correct that. I'll make some of these corrections, Josh, and send it to you so we can post this correctly.
What is the blue again?
Those are DC fast chargers.
Again, that's the projected, just the fast charger.
Yes, so that's it. That's the 14 that we have right now. We'll need between 49 and 60 by 2024. Level 2, the number that's shown is 339. In moderate, 405. Right now, we have 60, so you can see there's a dramatic increase that we need there. And then workplace level 2s, 486. And the low or the moderate growth scenario, and 614. So clearly, we're going to need a lot more charging infrastructure, and that's what's behind the rationale for the ordinance.
Can I ask, what kind of assumptions or ratio are used to get to the number of chargers needed compared to the number of vehicles? I mean, it's clearly not one for one, and do you know, is there an
I don't know the
industry standard
details.
assumption or anything?
Carleen, do you know by
or
chance,
how
or-
that
I didn't
gets-
see any of the notes on
Yeah.
that.
Okay,
Did-
yeah, I'm
if he
wondering what the
published those.
assumption is about,
We can.
how
we
many
can-
days they're driven in or parked or need to be
Right.
charged and all of that, but just out of curiosity, no.
Okay, we'll try to provide that in maybe the next meeting.
Sure.
I don't know why, oh, here, these are animated, sorry. What are some of the basics behind the rationale for the ordinance and how it will be structured? It will amend Ann Arbor's Uniform Development Code, or the UDC. It will apply to all projects requiring a site plan. Similar policies have been adopted by several other cities throughout the U.S. You'll see that on a next slide. It mandates a percentage of new parking spaces be either EV capable, EV ready, or EV installed. It's obviously intended to prepare the city for the expected growth of EVs that we saw. One of the basics behind it is that by installing conduit and/or wire in new construction, we save a tremendous amount of money, and there was an estimate that I'll show in the next slide. So our status is that we have a complete draft. Our parking space requirements by use type have been defined, and I'll show you a high-level overview of what those are. So this is, without getting into a whole lot of detail, this is basically the 3 levels. The first is that you have sized the electric panel and put conduit in place or wiring in place to be able to put a charger in at some future date. EV ready means not only have you put the conduit in, but you have actually wired it. You've pulled the wire and you've put in the circuit breakers and you've put a plug in so that all you basically need to do is plug in or somehow tie in a charger to that. And then EV installed is, as the picture shows, everything is complete, and all someone has to need to do is basically pull up and start charging their vehicle, potentially with a credit card or something like that, to pay for the electricity. So this was a study that San Francisco did in 2016, showing a cost breakdown of putting in a charger in new construction. This is in a kind of commercial situation. You can see for new construction, it's basically $920. But if you have to go in and retrofit that, basically digging up things and stuff like that, replacing panels in certain cases, then there's a tremendous increase in cost to roughly $3,500, or roughly an increase of 285%. So it really makes sense, we think, not to do this upfront, and we think, there's rationale for having an ordinance, but there's rationale just from the perspective of anyone looking at a project to doing this upfront if they want to attract customers, if they're a hotel or a B&B, or if they're a retailer, if they're an employer, that it makes sense that they work on this proactively, and this financial argument is a good one. So without getting into all the details, you can see that for those of you who are able to read the small print, A lot of cities that have done this already: Boulder, Colorado; Denver, Colorado; Lansing, Michigan; Los Angeles; Palo Alto; San Francisco; Atlanta. These are all cities that we've benchmarked. You can see there's various levels. And what we've also seen is that as ordinances such as the one Ann Arbor is looking at, the requirements have gone up as time has gone on, as people have seen that the adoption rate is going up higher and higher.
Are we benchmarking any specific one of these?
No, we
Or
looked
any?
at, we looked at
Just
all of
look
them.
at all.
We even had phone calls with some of them. City staff did and other people. So this is just sort of a high-level view of what is currently in the parking table. Actually, I'm going to go one forward and then come back. So this is really difficult for anybody that's not here behind the podium to read, and even then it's difficult. So there is a parking table that is currently in the UDC that says, if you build a new building, this is the minimum number of spaces that you have to put in. And we're just adding a column that basically says, of those spaces, that when someone installs those, these are the percentages, minimum percentages of EVC, EV capable, EV ready, and EV installed places that need to be put in if the ordinance were to pass.
Where did the percentages come from?
So the percentages were based on benchmarking, and then just looking at each one of these different types of uses. So this is just cut and pasted together some various areas. So the residential uses, I just took group living here, but there's a single family, there's multifamily section under public institutional uses. This shows healthcare, but there's retail and other things that's under commercial. Actually, it shows lodging here, but there's a section on retail. This is just to show you what the structure of the table looks like. And what the group did was, over, I would say, multiple iterations, including feedback from presenting this to the Ordinance Review Committee, came up with the figures that are in the table now. And these are basically the high-level categories that I think are of interest to this group. So you can see single-family and townhouses we're saying should be 100% EV ready. So any new construction, rather than paying the premium later, should be basically made EV ready. We're not mandating that the charger be installed. If you're looking at multifamily and student cooperatives, other types of multifamily residential, we're saying 65% EVC, 25% EVR, and 10% EVI. You can see offices, parking structures, healthcare and schools, 25% capable, 15% ready, 10% installed. Hotels, B&Bs, and other types of lodging, 25% capable, 50% ready, 25% installed. In that case, obviously, we're assuming people are going to be coming in. They may be coming in from somewhere afar. They're going to drive in with their electric vehicle, and if they don't have charging capability, then they're going to be stuck the next morning potentially. So we really think that it's in their interest to have a relatively high level of readiness. Recreational, public, and institutional, in those cases, other than employees, there's probably not a whole lot of people that are staying for a very long time at these kinds of places. So we have somewhat lower levels of readiness. And the same thing with retail, most retail other than the employees, and that's why we have 10% for EV installed. Most retailers, people are coming in, they may be spending an hour or less doing their shopping and then leaving. And so the number of people that will actually be charging there is set at a low minimum. Again, these are floors. That does not mean that a Costco or someone else could say, well, our profile of users is different and we want to have a higher level because this is what we think our customers need and will demand. So maybe I'll finish and then maybe come back to this table for comment. So this is trying to show the iterative process and the give and take of what we've done. So as you can see here, the EV working group, we've already have our drafts and our model requirements. We met with the Ordinance Revision Committee or Review Committee at the bottom. We're doing the Energy Commission review right now. Next step would be to gather some stakeholder input and then go to the Planning Commission. After that, there would be a legal review, and it would go to council. And then finally, Carlene, do you want to speak to this? Can you see it?
I can. Sure. Well, the figures in this slide reflect the computation that I did. I looked at all of, well, not all of them, there were more added after later in the year after I was done with the study. I looked at 22 of the site plans that were added to the city's projects website, their e-track it for 2019. And based on the costs that were presented and put together, again by Charles Griffith and the Ecology Center, they did a parallel analysis of costs for installing EV charging stations, like up to make-ready, not including the station itself, for the city of Ann Arbor, like the one that was done for San Francisco. But they just utilized the prices that are reflective of this part of the country. And based on the listed cost for every single site plan in the city's database and calculating the number of required EV capable, ready, or installed, or actually it's EV ready is what I was focusing on. The prices for, the comparative prices for installing, the percentage of installing, of the make-ready was 0.3% to 0.4% of the overall cost for new installation, the entire project cost. And then if they'd be installed as a retrofit, it would be from 0.7% to 0.19% of the overall project
So
cost.
you said overall project cost or just that parking spot cost?
So if the listed cost for the entire construction project in the, like a site plan, you know, the entire project.
Right, so it
This is
goes
the
up
percentage of
3%
the
because of
cost.
a couple parking
Three
spaces?
300s of
0.03%.
Yeah.
All right, I got you.
to
Yes.
accommodate EV readiness.
I got you, okay.
Is that supposed to be a new installation up to a .04? Or
Yeah, I think
No,
that's
0.4.
wrong.
0 point, from .03 to .4?
Yes.
Because
That's
it
a lot.
seems like for the new installation, then it goes up many-fold more than for the retrofit installation, which only goes up a few times more. Help me understand why that
The
is.
.19 on this slide, now that I look at it, looks wrong. It can't be right.
Okay,
Because we showed in the San Francisco case that it went up 285%, and this is actually lower under retrofit scenario than it is for new.
right, it's like 3X
So there may
roughly,
be
not even
a
3X.
decimal point that's wrong there. We'll
Okay.
double check that.
I can double check that, but I did notice that it
That
seemed
ratio
kind of
seems off,
weird.
yeah.
But it also depended on the type of construction project. So I don't know what kind of construction projects that the San Francisco study included, but there was a lot of residential and where it was 100% requirements, like, you know, like, so I was looking at all of that, all of those examples, and I can look back at the numbers and update the commission on that. It had to do with the type of projects.
okay. So they may not be apples to apples, really,
Exactly.
then, to compare this way.
If they were all offices that the San Francisco study was looking at, or, yeah, okay. Well, so when I just added up all of the number of EV-ready spaces, or EV-prepared spaces, I should say, because the term ready is being utilized already in this as a definition. There are a number of different spaces that, you know, let's say if they were all required already, if the ordinance was in play for the year 2019, based on the 22 site studies, we'd have these many spaces. We'd have 1,309 EV capable spaces already in, we'd have, or at least going in, we'd have 1,192 EV ready spaces and 175 EV installed spaces for the city.
So it's clear not all of these projects are, you know, basically planned completed and done in 2019. Some of these might be done over a period of, 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
But for those 22 that were being considered for site plans in 2019, over the period, were they all to be approved, and were this ordinance to have been in place, this is the number of additional spaces that we would have added. Right now, I think, I can't remember, were there any that you saw that were planned already for EV readiness?
There was one project,
Uh-huh.
and that was a latecomer that was added. It was the last one that I reviewed, and it's, yeah.
So this is in effect the opportunity cost for not having an ordinance in
Exactly.
place, is we could have had this many, and instead there was only one out of the 22 that foresaw any charging capability.
Maybe one takeaway I get from this, if I'm reading it correctly, is that if we were to put the ordinance in place very quickly, within a year or two, depending on these project cycle times, we would achieve the required number of parking spaces based
zero
on
bump,
the
right.
early projections, right?
Yes.
It's not like a
There's
heavy
a side
lift.
question to that, maybe John, you can answer this. I went through an audit today, so compliance is big on my head. Is the floor table, the table has floor values. If a site plan is gonna be reviewed by planning commission and you don't have enough to meet the table, is the site plan rejected? Or is there an alternative pathway to get a site plan approved that would not necessarily build those EV components?
I think I understand. So the ordinance requires a certain number of parking spaces. The ordinance would require certain percentages of those to include EV charging.
Right.
And so basically, if a site plan was brought in front of the planning commission that didn't meet that, then I'm assuming it would either be rejected or there would be some type of negotiation.
Okay, but there is room for negotiation. Okay.
Well, assuming that that it's proportional, so if they reduce the overall parking places, they don't take it out of all the EV charging.
I know of one development's going to push for fewer parking spaces than what's in the current table. So now the percentages are gonna get all goofed up. So I'm just curious how that works, and so it'll have to be a negotiation.
I'm presuming, Wayne, do you have any idea, or?
Well, I think that we actually put something, and maybe you can refresh my memory, in the ordinance that said that, see, normally, if you come with a site plan and you're proposing less than the number required by the code,
Right.
you actually have to have space allotted.
Mitigation, right?
And our ordinance said that the percentage installed, for instance, had to be of the total, including the ones that they weren't putting in.
Oh, yes.
We'll talk later.
We do have
That's
language
actually,
included to that.
that's in one of the slides includes that verbiage,
Yep.
so we can actually see what that is. But it's a percentage of the total parking spaces, not, so if, it's a subset of the required number of parking spaces.
Right.
So if a developer negotiates a smaller number than the required number of parking spaces, there's still the percentage of the EV, C, R, or I spaces that have to be met.
We'll talk later.
That's
I know-
part of what
yeah.
the idea is at this time.
Let's get the ignorant question here, which is, what does EV ready mean for the residential? So when you talk
EV
about
ready means that,
Does that just mean that there's an outlet in the garage? or
yep, a
what's-
240 volt outlet.
Okay.
Or a blank box,
Or a
that's
blank.
some, yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
just trying to see what it meant
Like a-
translated
Yep.
to residential.
So maybe we can come back to this, but, so all of us have access to this through the city website, and this includes a lot of the detailed information, so you can go through this to review it. My recommendation is that we, I'm just going to click through some of these. We not go through all of this tonight, but that we then, oops, I don't want to do that. Escape, I think. What I would propose that we do is ask commissioners to review this, and that we bring a resolution in support of what we have so far, so that as we move on to the other commissions and to legal, that we have the support of the commission in moving forward. Does that make sense to everybody here?
Yes, I'd like to voice a concern.
Yep.
We've been following this and tracking this at the state level. There's some hearings and stuff that are going on as well. There doesn't seem to be much concern or an appetite for requiring that EV chargers be powered with renewable energy. And I remain concerned that we're putting a lot of public dollars in and a lot of effort in to put these in, and they're powered with non-renewable energy that has a lot of emissions-related issues associated with them. So I'm not sure whether it's in this ordinance or where, but it seems to me that these two things go hand in hand. I'm all for putting in EV charging stations. And just like the picture here, this one is powered with residential. So if we're not going to do publicly funded and supported EV chargers that are tied to renewable energy, perhaps we should be encouraging more of these standalone ones instead. So I'm not sure how to do that, but I'd certainly like to see at least a statement in the ordinance that the city would be encouraged to figure out how to do that, because I know that Missy shares my concerns on this.
So we talked about this. Mark, you even made
Yep.
the comment, I think, in an email. So this applies, we're just inserting this in an existing parking table.
Right.
This is going to apply to all different kinds of buildings and all kinds of situations. So you may have a residence going in an area where there's no solar access. It may be going in, it may apply to a new building going in downtown where you have.
I'm not talking about on-site solar. I'm just saying that if it requires another customer request with DTE or a dedication or, whatever, but
So we would be
linking these two.
essentially mandating that anybody that puts in.
Public.
Okay, yeah, well, no, this applies to everything. So this applies to any kind of construction, whether it's residential, multifamily, retail, funeral homes, I mean, everything's in here. We would basically be mandating with this ordinance that they buy renewable energy to be able to power their EV charging. And we felt that was a step too far for where we're at right now.
If I can add on to that, I think risks being counterproductive. The Union of Concerned Scientists has an awesome calculator on their website that I encourage anyone who's considering a vehicle purchase to look at. I looked at it when I was trying to decide on my latest vehicle purchase a few years ago now, but whether to go hybrid or electric. And they allow you to put basically your state so you know what the electric grid mix is. And electric vehicles are just more efficient flat out. So even if you were on, Michigan's grid from 5 years ago, an electric vehicle is still, from a life cycle perspective, still significantly lower emissions than a gasoline vehicle. So while I don't disagree that we should hope that, this additional load gets more and more of it coming from renewables, I think we'd actually be counterproductive. We should all go to from an emissions perspective, we should all go to electric even on today's grid.
So my response to this is that we started out the meeting with showing, where we are in terms of emissions and where we have to get to, and this really hard curve we're going to have to go through. And here we're embarking on an effort to encourage a lot more electric vehicle charging, and those electrical vehicle chargers run on electricity. So it seems logical to me to encourage them being charged with renewables. And if we don't say that, then the discipline is not put forth to at least ask the question, should we be doing this or not on this particular instance?
Well, I can address that with regards to this exact in particular project. What we did is then with the site plan study that I did, is I looked at these formulas, and then I went, plan by plan, and just like put myself in the position of the architects and engineers, and also the planners who are going to be reviewing these projects, to see what they'll be looking at. And it's like a nuts and bolts. Inside of the parking table, there's just an added, subgroup, and it just rolls up. So thinking about where you would add the requirement or even the suggestion of connecting the, those charging stations, or at least the power that is going to be being used to charge those vehicles to solar, there was not a place that was like, prescriptive. And what you're talking about is more like aspirational. And this is what, we're here to work on at this point in time, and the Evie Ordinance is one piece of it. It's one block that will be helping to hopefully make it easier for that energy to charge our transportation to be renewable.
So we're going to put 25 megawatts of new solar in, and what I'm hearing is that even though that solar will go to a public building, there's no guarantee or encouragement that the EV charger that is at that public building, library or city hall, et cetera, that part of that 25 megawatts should be allocated or accounted for with that EV charging. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to
I
me.
respectfully disagree, Mark, because I think everything we're working on here is to push toward more renewables and cleaner electricity generation. I think it complicates things very much and potentially slows things down and everything if you try to combine those two, because they are quite distinct. One of them having to do with the chargers, and then all the other things we're working on, or many of the other things we're working on, having to do with greening the electricity that charges it, and so I don't think it means we're not working on it or not encouraging it. We're just separating them out, because even if we aren't able to achieve the cleaning up the grid, even if we're not able to achieve that, it's still worth our while to have the EVs.
So if I may, I applaud Mark's thrust. So what I've done is I've written it down. I would recommend that the subcommittee look at the point, see if it could somehow be accommodated, or if there's some other workaround that essentially promotes what Mark is getting at. We haven't finalized the resolution. We haven't come to you with, an ordinance. We haven't finalized the ordinance. We're not bringing you an ordinance, the ordinance and a resolution tonight. So I would recommend that when we do come back, we anticipate Mark's question again, and we be in a position to respond to it beyond what we've said already tonight with more specificity. How's
Appreciate it.
that?
Thank you.
And I think we need to do this to each other all the time, and that's Mark's point. And I think it's a point well taken.
Thank you.
Sound good?
Okay, yes, so you said, come back in February with a resolution. Are you planning to draft a resolution for us to review then at that point?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay,
I mean,
on the February agenda.
I would say tentatively, let's plan on that. We haven't taken this to the full planning commission yet, so it may be out of order. It might make more sense for us to take this to planning commission, but we can talk about that with staff and with planning commission and within the subcommittee. And if the alignment is that it makes sense to get some type of resolution of support from this commission first, then we'll do that. If there's a consensus that that's just the wrong order of doing things, then we'll come back and inform you. How's that sound?
Really quickly jump in. Just to let you know too, we have already submitted this for legal. We've met with them and sort of started briefing. So what is already drafted has been put in the queue in case there is any kind of fatal issue. We wanted to address it early. So
Perfect.
just wanted you to know, we started that.
Thank
So
you.
I'll put a dotted check
Yeah,
next to that.
data check. And then, so planning commission is next week, right? That we're going to be presenting to,
Great.
presenting to planning commission next week.
Thanks, you guys, for the very good and hard work on this. It's been a while.
Yeah, we started November of 18. That's when our first meeting was.
Awesome to have this here. Thank you. Okay, if we are done with that presentation and conversation, then we can move on to the Electrification Ordinance Resolution conversation. And this one you do have in front of you. It says draft copy, drafted by the Climate Mobilization. This is the one that our member of the public, Mr. Garber, was mentioning to us. I guess, I'm trying to remember, Josh, was this one circulated beforehand, or should we read it before we begin the discussion?
Might as well read it just in case.
Okay, it's
thought it
long.
might have been.
It's long, that's the only reason to, but let's go ahead, we can read it. Does
Should
somebody?
we
Yeah?
introduce it as a motion before we start reading it, or no?
I think this was more kind of just a conversation around it. I
Fine.
think the ordinance process is usually more involved. We have to go through, for example, legal and make sure, kind of a staff review the whole process. So it's more, I think, just getting a sense as to what the content is of,
Yeah, so, and I
Fine.
think that is how Mr. Garber presented it, as not necessarily an ordinance that's ready to vote on or a resolution ready to vote on, but to ask us to consider it and discuss it, and, if we decide we want to move forward with it after tonight, to have probably one of our subcommittees take a deeper dive on it over the next, month or two, or however long it takes, and then to come back with a recommendation of any edits or so forth, and at that point, think about taking a vote. So I don't believe we need a motion to discuss at this point, yeah.
I have a question. First of all, personally, I would prefer that we not read through all this, because I don't think there's a lot of value add unless we are resolved to vote on this tonight. There was some email correspondence, Missy, I think from you to Ken about this specifically, and I think it might be relevant to the commission's work tonight, and I was wondering if you might then share that with the entire commission, and we might take that into consideration about how indeed we handle this matter tonight.
Yeah, so there, I think you addressed many of the ideas here. One, we should say electrification is unequivocally one of the things that's going to be part of A20. It's very clear that's coming up, and this is very much in that vein. So rest assured, we are asking these kinds of questions too. We know we are preempted at the moment from changes in the building code, and I think what's really interesting about this, we actually need to spend far more time looking at this in depth, but this is really well crafted. It's very creative, kind of getting around that, but because it's creative, it means we're going to have to do some legal analysis about, is there precedent around this? What does this actually look like? So that's where we are going to move in that direction. Simultaneously, we know that other communities, especially in California, and you heard Brookline, Massachusetts, have done bans, and so we're reaching out to those communities to pull what those ordinances look like, to understand the replicability here. So I think the recommendation of a subcommittee is a really smart one for this, because we have a great template that I think we're going to want to move, but I want it, just like you, to pass when it does, to actually have traction. So I think we have to spend a little bit of time unpacking it a bit.
Is this already with legal or not yet?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet with
But the
legal.
concept, you're saying the
So
concept is with legal.
That concept is solidly with legal in that space. So they know this is coming. We have a list of lots and lots of ideas that have emerged that are going to need legal analysis. So it has not formally gone in this format yet, and that's partly because staff really has to understand the ask. We're not ready to go and answer all of the questions that are going to come from this particular draft.
Devil's in the details probably
Always.
on many of these, yeah.
A couple of other things. This is a project that was brainstormed as a part of the energy portion of A20.
Yes.
So the TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee, is going to be evaluating this along with the other ones. I think it's highly likely that this will emerge. I sent also an email around to some people, I can't remember exactly to whom. There was an article in the New York Times about a week ago. Bellingham, Washington is actually looking at a complete ban on all gas, which would essentially require by a date certain, and they have not yet finalized their resolution and ordinance, but they would define a date by which time all appliances and all HVAC equipment, et cetera, would have to be converted to fully electric. So not only is this being looked at residentially in terms of bans on new construction, there's obviously people that are pushing the envelope and we would be potentially in that group, certainly here in the state of Michigan. And personally, I think these are the kinds of things we need to do when we're talking about an emergency. One of the things that I would ask, if we do approach legal, having worked in my earlier work professionally, when we go to legal, good legal advice is not just what we can't do, but also what you can do, what your options are, and what your risks are for each one of those. And I would hope that when we go to legal, they can tell us, this is what you absolutely can't do. These are potential workarounds and things like that, with the following potential risks.
Yeah, so the discourse has changed. Historically, it has been, this is what we're thinking to do, what can we do this? And we've totally changed that discourse. I also should add that part of our A20 is also internal, and so we've met with each of the departments and we're going to legal to get their ideas for what we should be doing around carbon neutrality, and to present these and say, we're gonna need you. Like, here, look at this. This is the smorgasbord of things that we're thinking about. So I completely agree, and I just wanna reiterate that we have to question the possible right now, and that's what we're asking folks to do.
So I just, I know it didn't happen here, but it happened in the Netherlands, but the recent court about the forcing the countries, Denmark, to have to meet its 25, reduce its stuff, that precedent, that legal precedent may not impress the lawyers who work for the city of Ann Arbor, but it will affect risk assessment, and it really will affect insurance issues. So I would hope when the legal looks at this, that they look at the larger issues of, if we don't do something, what are our potential liabilities if this issue of health and safety and existential threat to humanity is somehow packaged as a lawsuit, and what that means.
I appreciate that, yeah.
Yeah.
It's the avoided
It will be
costs, like,
packaged as a
there's this
lawsuit.
cost,
This
there's
is-
this cost, or there's this
right,
cost,
right.
right? That's smart.
If I can just take a moment, since we're not going to read the ordinance, but for anybody who doesn't have it in front of them, might be watching on TV, what we have in front of us is a draft that is proposing prohibiting new natural gas hookups for new construction. And so, we've talked about different permutations of that, and I think if a subcommittee takes and looks at this, this version will be one consideration, but I just wanted to make sure people knew roughly the outlines of what we were looking at. Other thoughts or reactions on this?
I guess I just have a comment, as just another idea. I'm sure it'll get further developed by other subcommittees and whatever. I fully support the banning, at some time period. Obviously, there's a legal review of that, but just another idea to think of is just what kind of carrots and sticks do we have as a city? What kind of financial fees or permits, for gas lines that we can progressively increase over time to de-incentivize the gas line installations, so that at least people can kind of plan for it instead of an immediate 100% ban, kind of a phasing economic cost of installing it to encourage.
Well, I think this is new buildings, major rehabilitation, so.
Right, even so, I mean, like
Major
an
rehabs and
extra
stuff. That was-
$1,000 on your building
Yeah.
permit fee for gas line hookup this year, and it's $5,000 next year and $10,000 a year after. Or something where we can, and maybe that money can go towards, low-income housing or something, where we could use the money to incentivize an equitable, transition for people who can't afford the higher cost electrical appliances or something. So, instead of just an outright ban, just some kind of phased-in economic policy based on whatever kind of things that the city can actually charge, whether it's in property tax or building permits or whatever.
Yeah, I guess I would acknowledge that I have a lot of questions about this, and truly like genuine questions, a lot of things I don't know, many things that are probably unknown, but to to the extent, that a subcommittee is gonna take this up, I just wanna share kind of the questions in my head, for consideration. And, one of them is just thinking about kind of the degree of impact. This is maybe a little bit like EVs, but probably much slower. Like, it takes a very long time for stock to change. So the near-term impact is pretty small. The longer-term impact, could be bigger, although, our housing stock is 100-year cycles, right? And so, so how much of a lift do you actually get in terms of total impact of this over what period of time? And then how much of a lift is it in terms of time and energy and legal battles and political will and all to actually make this happen versus something else, that might have a nearer term or larger impact longer term with similar or lower levels of, challenge associated with actually getting it done. And I don't know the answer to that, but I'd be interested in hearing how people think about, what are those trade-offs? I just even think about the energy audit at time of sale issue that we have a subcommittee looking at, and kind of the, what I heard to be the visceral and immediate reaction of the realtor community, and, you think about the builder community here and developer community, and what that would look like to engage them, and whether the battle would be enormous or not, I don't know. I think about the, I'd like to see data on like the cost differential right now and, down the line of a non-natural gas, of electrified, residential electrification compared to natural gas, and thinking about that in terms of kind of the public response, whether there's appetite for that. I think I tried to articulate this, and I think not very articulately at all, at our last work session when we were talking about some of the issues and the economics associated with them. But for my day job, I know that most people are actually pretty price sensitive to the cost of their energy, and a 3% increase, here and there, and people start to get pretty frustrated and push back on a lot of things. It's not to say it's not the right thing to do, but what do we think about kind of the public aspect there? I think from a bigger impact question, I do wonder if this is in Ann Arbor and not in our outlying communities. Do we start to get folks who don't see it as worthwhile to either build new in Ann Arbor, which, maybe not so much, it's not like there's all that much land remaining in Ann Arbor for brand new builds, but I think we do have a lot of old housing stock that younger families are trying to come in and, add on a second story to some of our older stuff and renovate and do a major, maybe gut renovation that this could apply to. And is this enough of a disincentive that some of those folks will go to new construction, further out? And I firmly believe that density has to be, and keeping people living close to where they work, has to be a big piece of how Ann Arbor responds to the climate challenge. And so what's the trade-off there? Do you actually end up pushing people to the suburbs, and then you've kind of negated any of the benefit you thought you might get? And then I'm going to fully admit that, so I just had all these questions floating around in my head, and there's also a trade-off between spending the massive amount of time I think it would be to try and answer those and even think through them versus the fact that we're in an emergency and we do need to move quickly, right? And so I just throw this out there to let you guys know kind of where my head is at, because I think I'm going to run into these roadblocks just intellectually for me as we move forward with this one, because it does feel like it has a lot of complicating factors. Sorry, I just talked a long time.
I firmly
Spilled
believe
my
in
guts.
karma. I believe in karma. I think this is the right thing to do. So, when we did the solar thing, less than 7 communities actually taxed solar, and nobody cared about it, and it had been locked up in committee for 8 years, and everybody that we talked to said, this is not going to happen, there's nothing there. And then we began to get allies, and people began to see what the future implications of things were. I think we dive into this and see. I think we're going to, some people are going to walk away, but other people are going to walk in and new things. So if you have to retrofit a house, that means you have to probably, maybe you could extend the life of that old stove a little longer, but, if you're going to have to buy a new one, so now you got to buy an electric one. So it gets, there are ways, if we need to incentivize this, then that's a conversation worth having. If you are a house that's 100% electric, you should get a tax break for doing so, and that's something the city can do and has control over. And so, to me, it's not a question of, should we do it, but how do we do it? And let's begin to look at it and push it, and objections will rise, but so will support.
That's totally fair, yeah. So, I know we'll move, after this, I think, well, we've got one more thing we can talk about, but, we will move into our subcommittee updates. Do we have a committee, I think it would, my gut feel is it would fall into the Housing and Built Environment Committee or the Energy Production Committee. Does
How about the housing and building?
Housing and Built Environment, yeah.
But I'll be happy to join that committee to work on this with them.
Okay, we'll add you, Mark. Make sure you get added to those meeting invites. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, John. Okay, anything else on the electrification conversation?
Excellent.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to solar installs. So this was a request and action item to Josh to look at how the city has done with solar installs year over year.
So, as you can see from the graphs here, 2019 was a very good year for solar installs. We kind of look at previous permits pulled, so this was done both through permits, we have a track it system, and then from there, we go a little deeper to get design plans, and we can get the actual capacity of each of the installs. And so you can see from basically 2018, you get some fluctuation right around 33, 34, right around there. And then for 2019, we closed out at 88. I would like to think that a lot of the outreach we did contributed to this. And I do think it did. I mean, we had 3 power hours with, $300,000 worth of installs. Missy talked a little bit about the Solarized Program, where we were getting, 60 people out with 19 installs after that. I do think that there's probably something else going in here as well, which is net metering, and the fact that people knew that net metering was running out. Right. And so obviously I think that plays heavily into this. I tried to kind of look at the numbers on a monthly basis, and I did see that, right around December, because net metering, they had kind of a window from the time that they pulled the permit to when they actually installed. Right around December, there was a bit of a drop-off. It could be because, it's the winter season, that's to be expected somewhat. But I think next year we'll really get a sense as to how much this was kind of a result of net metering versus, some momentum. And I think it's probably a combination of both. I mean, I think
I know installers that were installing solar on Christmas Day.
Yeah, well, there you go, right.
I mean, it was a real push.
Yeah, but I mean, it's at the same time, I think it's really good to see, I mean, especially when you're looking at everything before 2019. 2019 year does look, very kind of an outlier, even though we still have a very long way to go.
I can't do the math in my head, but do you know if there's been any meaningful change in the size of,
Yes.
Individual
Yeah.
arrays?
So that's the other thing I found when I was looking at the permits I thought was really interesting. The average size has actually gone up.
Yeah.
So it was around 4 kilowatts roughly on average, and I did kind of just a rough average to see how it all panned out before like 2015, 2016. And then it went up to about 6, I think it was 6.8 average, everything forward to
They're getting more
2019.
efficient, right? So per panel on the same square footage of roof, you can get a bigger.
Well, yeah, and I was also wondering if the price of solar going down meant that people were willing to get larger
put more in,
systems, especially as we've seen, I remember when I first started and you were seeing, $3 per, watt installed. And now we're getting down to $2.50. I mean, I've even seen, some of the stuff that we've installed in our own buildings, $2. So I think that might also be playing into this somewhat. So
In 2018, we put in 3 30-watt panels.
Yeah.
2018, they were the best you could buy.
Right.
Today, 400 plus.
Right. Right.
for the same price or less.
Yeah.
So there you're seeing a major impact.
Yep.
So I think there's multiple factors. We also do have expedited permitting, which I like to think somewhat helps. We're doing it as well. I don't know how much, we talked about this at the Energy Commission, but we did a similar thing for commercial buildings. It was very cost prohibitive to go through permitting with the city. So we reduced those costs significantly to ensure, that it didn't put too much burden on installing solar. So those are a few things, a few highlights. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that, Josh, really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Can you send me a copy of this slide?
Of course, yeah. Yeah, I can, it's actually, so it is on Legistar.
Oh, okay.
But I'll go ahead and send it to the group if.
Please.
Yep.
Excellent.
So like as a percentage of like total,
Yeah.
homes or roofs or properties, it'd be interesting to see how this is
The
shifting.
total, yeah. Yeah, so I could just do a quick,
291.
50,000 roughly units versus 291. It's still a rather small number.
Yeah.
But I mean, still,
It's
it's one of
moving.
those things, I think if we can continue that kind of momentum in some way, it's exciting.
There's
Trend
one
line is
that's
good.
not on here.
Yeah.
It's the STEAM school, because that went through the state
Okay, Yeah.
building,
so we're technically,
Office.
yeah,
and so that one went in just after Thanksgiving,
yeah.
12 kilowatts.
All right, so 292.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right. Moving on then to committee updates. So this is, welcome to 2020, by the way. I should have said Happy New Year. We've got a new list of committees. So these are the new committees that we developed kind of under our work session back in the fall. And obviously, some of the old subcommittee projects that are still open are folded under these. But housing, built environment, and energy efficiency, that one has the time of sale audit still under it. Is there any update from anyone who's been engaged in that and wants to weigh in? Otherwise, we're just giving you an assignment on electrification, so,
Yeah, I will say, I sent out doodle polls for each of these groups.
yes.
And I'm going to go ahead and finalize those. I wanted to give everyone up to commission, basically. I'll finalize those and send out basically a calendar invite based off those doodle polls so we know when they are. I do know that there's things that are rolling over into them. So, Shoshana, as you were saying, kind of the, a time of marketing, which we have kind of an update. I guess the update I'll give is that we're looking at like a phone call that we had with both Austin as well as Portland to see the outcome of their time of marketing ordinances, in particular with an eye towards total energy efficiency upgrades that came from those kind of energy disclosures. And so I think we took a lot of notes, and I think our next meeting we agreed that we were going to kind of pour over those notes and try to really assess as to what was going on that front. I think now we had the electrification as well that we'll be looking at.
Okay.
Transportation, I think, is the EV readiness.
Yeah, EV readiness we covered. Is there anything else on transportation? I would just mention, we had one action item from a ways back this past summer around the rolling sculpture car show. We wanted to make sure we reached out to them with plenty of lead time to see whether they would consider including some EVs there. So,
I did contact
great.
someone at the Main Street Area Association just yesterday, unfortunately.
Awesome.
But my initial response was that it was a great idea, and they were going to take it to their committee and get back to me. So the conversation is started.
thank you,
And
terrific.
I was trying to get more info just on their process as far as, so I'll hopefully have more for next month.
Awesome, thanks so
yeah,
much, Jim.
Yep.
Okay,
And she didn't, didn't seem like it was too late yet, so I think we're getting there.
okay, very good. Anything else on transportation that we missed? Okay, energy production.
We're scheduling our first meeting. We met tonight and we're comparing calendars and the
Very good.
emails going back and forth are too crazy, so we're doing it the old-fashioned way, is looking each other in the eye and going like this.
On a paper calendar,
paper
no
calendar.
less, I see. Okay, thank you, Mark.
All right.
And community engagement. Again, a new committee, pardon me. Did we get a date set for those meetings?
So they'll be coming
Yeah,
out.
okay. Okay. Anything else on subcommittees? Okay, with that, we will move on to open it up for public input again, if any of the members of the public would like to share something. Seeing no takers, I will move on. Items for the next agenda. I captured that we will have a resolution in support of the draft EV ordinance, and I believe John will bring that resolution here for us. I'm just looking at our action items, which I did print out for folks, by the way. Is there anything else on here? We had talked about, I believe, the transportation subcommittee, but more broadly, for the commission and in its entirety, following up on our work session last month, was interested in having a couple folks from the transportation group coming to talk to us about like that survey that we talked about around the major infrastructure and what kind of, how they would like to engage with us. So hopefully we'll have them here in February,
So we do
possibly.
have that, yeah, we have the meeting set up for Friday, where the chairs will all get together, and we'll try to figure out what best way to kind of interact with the different commissions. Part of it was that they have a subcommittee, a transportation subcommittee, that we give updates to. And so there's a question as to whether it makes sense to have kind of a liaison model, or what best way to interact with the different commissions going forward, especially with our joint goals. The other side of that too, I did ask specifically about the survey, and they again kind of referred me back to the subcommittee and said if there was more information that in this Friday meeting we could ask more about that and figure out what works.
Okay, all right.
So other than promoting and the work with the EV readiness ordinance and then promoting electric vehicle adoption, what are some of the other transportation initiatives that the Energy Commission in particular would be wanting to take on?
So I mean, my
In terms
perspective,
of, like,
right,
your
like that
thoughts, yeah.
I mean, the transportation committee, certainly that survey was looking at all modes of transit on major thoroughfares in the city, and looking at public input on whether public transit, motor vehicles, bicycle, or pedestrian traffic should be prioritized. And, as I kind of shared in our work session, I think if you're looking at the energy and environmental impact, on these major thoroughfares, there's clear, implications of choosing one of those methods over others, right, and prioritizing them. And those are, it sounds like major projects, right? So like gonna have a very long-term, 30-year impact on what modes of transit are really feasible for people. So I had proposed, should our commission be providing our input to that and providing guidance around, the potential energy and climate impacts of making different decisions about those different modes of transit. So not just, the EV stuff is about our vehicles, our public or private vehicles, but what input are we providing around public transit, around walkability, bicycle infrastructure? And, I kind of put that out there to say, if and how do we want to, and how would they like our input? I guess if they don't want our input, we could still give it,
And I guess both myself and Carleen were on the mobility TAC, so I think maybe we can leverage kind of
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
process to help us see what we want to focus on, or
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's an important point, Jay, from a broader perspective, right, is as we've talked about over the last couple of months, we want to make sure that what we're working on here doesn't get completely out of sync with what the techs are working on and what they're recommending, if, it doesn't make sense to be walking in opposite directions.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Okay. Anything else coming in February? Not on our list. Our action item list had 2 things in February that were covered today on the solar installs and the OSI update, so I think we can check those off. But anybody that has anything they want to add over the course of the next month, send a note to Josh to add to the agenda. Okay. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, we adjourn. Thank you very much.